Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of World War II, right? So the biggest thing about it is, before we get any further, we got to understand one big thing. You have a test coming up. You need to go off and study. It's very, very important. We've got one other thing to talk about real quick. This is your last flip, right? Isn't that crazy? This is your last flip. It's been a long, long year and stuff like that. Well, not a long year, but like a year that's going by so quickly and stuff like that. And we're going to be in the summer in like no time at all. But let's go ahead and get into the content of this flip so you don't have to have a really, really long last flip, right? I'd like to keep it to a decent length. So the biggest thing about it, though, is when we're getting into it, we're now talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? We left off talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor in our classes and stuff like that, talking about when the Japanese attacked the American Pacific Fleet that was in its harbor at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And this, of course, is going to happen on December 7th, 1941. Now, why did the Japanese do this? We talked about how in class they cut off, or the Americans, due to the invasion of Manchuria, cut off a massive amount of crude oil going to Japan and refused to actually send it to them anymore. And the Japanese are going to retaliate by attacking Pearl Harbor. Now, this is going to be the event that brings the Americans into the war, right? Now, the interesting thing about it that a lot of y'all are probably thinking to yourself, though, is like, okay, so you would go and attack this general region first, right? Would you go to the Pacific and immediately set up shop and start trying to liberate all the areas that Japan has invaded, like Manchuria and the Philippines, New Guinea and the Solomon Islands? Wouldn't you go there first? Because they attacked us. Well, ironically enough, we're going to go here first, right? We actually end up just like going into Europe first and foremost and trying to liberate all of this stuff in tan and dark tan right here that has actually been taken over by the Axis powers, right? So that's the whole thing. We go after Europe first, right? Now, something that you need to understand in this really, really quick is we have two theaters to this war, right? Not one, but two. Two theaters. We have a European theater and we have a Pacific theater, right? The Pacific theater is when we actually go and try to attack Japan and like liberate the islands there. And then the European theater is when we actually go and try to liberate all that stuff that was occupied by the Nazi army and the Italian army and then also the Hungarians and Romanians and the rest of the Axis powers, right? But we go after Europe first, right? So the Allies sought to liberate Europe and then turn towards Japan. Now, there's a lot of theories behind why this is. A lot of historians believe it's because the Americans felt they were going to need support when they actually went after like Japan, and they didn't want to thin out their resources too much. Kind of a lot like when we're looking at like the whole two-front war in World War I for the Germans. Do you want to necessarily cut your army in half and send it in two different directions? Well, Europe was the main source that they wanted to go after first, so they could then possibly ask for British, French, and other allied help going into Japan as well. Now, going into it, though, the European theater for World War II is going to last from about 1941 to about 1945, and it's going to encompass about three different steps, right? Three big steps are going to go down, or three things are going to go down as we get into this European theater. Well, the first one is that the Allies had to figure out a way to invade Europe when it was so taken over by the Germans, right? Like, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? You can't go in this general region in the north of France because those Nazis have completely solidified it. You can't really invade Germany directly. That's going to be a massacre. You can't go into Italy directly. You can't go into Spain because Franco controls that. Where are you going to go? Well, the thing about it that you can't really see on that map that I just showed you is that when Germany, like, allied with the south of France and took over France and, like, 2 months into the war, they took control as well of all of this stuff in North Africa, right? So North Africa had a lot of, France had a lot of holdings in North Africa and a lot of imperial colonies. So the Americans decide to actually invade that area first. And the idea was going to be invade North Africa and then push the Nazi forces and the Italian forces all the way back, push them all the way backwards, and then up into Italy. And if you can keep pushing those lines up in Italy, then you can come into Germany from the south, right? So that was the original plan under people like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the leader of the American forces and later on became president. And also under General Patton, who was like the actual like general of the mobile artillery and stuff like that. So they wanted to invade North Africa in this thing called Operation Torch to push the Axis back all the way into Italy. And also because, you know, what's going to happen during this whole thing is Germany's going to freak out because they see us coming. And so Germany occupies the rest of France, right? They go down into the rest of France and South France, begin to build fortifications on their southern borders towards North Africa, right? Because they know that we're coming. When our Western Task Force, Central Task Force, and Eastern Task Force landed, they actually, ironically enough, landed pretty unopposed. Now, it's important to remember this little kind of picture in the back of your mind going into one that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. They landed unopposed. They actually had a pretty successful attempt at pushing the Axis powers back and up into Italy. Now, meanwhile, the Soviets had one job. They had to hold off the Nazis. They had to hold off the Germans in like Russia and keep being that offensive line in football, right? Just preventing them from falling. And so there are two really, really large cities that are actually going to withstand the bombardment by the Nazi army. and it's going to be that of Stalingrad and Leningrad, right? Now, Stalingrad is a very, very large factory city, and Leningrad is the new name for St. Petersburg, right? So the thing about it is, well, what ends up happening is like Leningrad and Stalingrad, actually Leningrad might be the name for Moscow. I got to look that up here in about 2 seconds, okay? So now the biggest thing about it, though, is Stalingrad, that factory city that was built by Stalin and stuff like that, and Leningrad just refused to surrender. The Nazis attacked it relentlessly using artillery bombardments and stuff like that for years. They attacked it for almost 4 years, leading to the death of 26 million Soviet citizens, right? Now, going into it, though, this is what these cities began to look like as the Nazis began to attack. But the thing about it is that the Soviets just refused to surrender, and had to hold on until the Americans got there to actually replenish the forces and thin out the German forces, forcing them to actually open up. What we can see now is going to be, yet again, a two-front war, right? We want to actually force the Germans to fight on two fronts. If we can force them to come down through Italy and spare some of their forces, and that's going to thin out their reserves on the east, and the Russians might be able to push back, right? Now, it was so crazy, though, because the Russians literally, rather than surrender, were very well known for eating soup made out of rats and wallpaper during the siege, which is disgusting. Can you imagine literally being like, I can surrender, or I can eat this rat and wallpaper soup? I don't know if this is going to taste good. I think it needs Tony's or something on it. Now look, the second step in this whole process, though, is while we're invading North Africa and while the Russians are holding them back, the second step is to move up through Italy. Once we go into North Africa, we got to bump up into Italy. But the problem is that the Italian campaign was not the best decision on the planet. Italy is very, very thin, right? It's a very, very geographically thin. It's only about 100 miles wide. It was very easy using the hilly terrain and stuff like that for the Axis powers and the Italians to dig in. And it's going to end up stalling us out, right? And so the Allies actually get into Italy. They don't really move as fast as we had wanted to. So we're going to do what we didn't do in World War II, or excuse me, World War I. We're going to come at them with pincer move. What we're going to do is actually, you know what? How about we go 3 fronts on this war, right? Let's open up 3 fronts on this war rather than 2. And let's force the Germans to fight on all sides, right? Let's try to come at them from every angle, like a crab claw, right? Like a pincer move. So the idea, though, is going to be we must open up another front because we have been stalled out in Italy. And so that is going to lead to one of the most famous military operations known to existence, known as D-Day, right? Or AKA Operation Overlord. So D-Day occurred on June 6, 1941. And what it's going to be is a direct invasion of France. And the idea is going to be to try and open up another front right here in the north of France and use England as a jumping off point, okay? And it was supposed to be one of the most massive amphibious assaults on any centralized location known in most of Western history, right? And it's going to happen on June 6, 1944. Now, that's crazy, right? June 6, 1944. That's late in the game. This war ends in May of 1945. So this is a very successful operation, right? The Allies mounted a massive joint assault on the beaches of Normandy to open up a gaping hole in the Nazi defenses, right? And the plan was that they were going to actually drop off 3 gigantic waves of soldiers in the thousands. The other thing you need to understand, though, is that this was extremely dangerous, right? Very, very dangerous because the assault was not supposed to be only 1, but 2 methods, right? There was going to be an air raid assault, like as you can see with the planes right here, and also an amphibious assault by the sea. And they were actually going to go and attack 5 separate beaches located on this point of the Normandy beaches right here, okay? And it was like Omaha, or what was it? Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, or the names of the actual beaches themselves. And they decided to go and attack this and just overwhelm the Nazi forces completely. But this is going to lead to the death of a lot of soldiers, right? A huge number of American soldiers are going to die in the D-Day invasion due to the fact that literally it's just such a heavily defended area. They had massive concrete bunkers and pillboxes, literally machine guns just lighting people, shooting at the men that were falling off onto the actual beaches and trying to run up them. Now, why do I have these little question marks right here? That was the only reason, one of the only reasons we were able to actually push through this area is because literally we just sent a bunch of messages making the Nazis confused, thinking we're coming at a bunch of different places. But this right here is an actual image of Operation Overlord and D-Day, because the idea was supposed to be that while paratroopers dropped behind the enemy lines and tried to attack them from behind, amphibious soldiers were dropped in naval craft and had to run up these beaches while Nazi machine guns were waiting for them on this ridge, right? It was a very, very chaotic assault, and literally it led to the death of hundreds and hundreds of people, but it was successful. The first 2 waves were successful and broke through the enemy lines, and we have now officially opened up a new front in this war, right? Because the Allies, once they actually win Operation D-Day, or excuse me, Operation Overlord on D-Day, they actually begin to push into France quickly and very, very fast, taking small cities like Carentan and other ones like that outside of Paris. They show up in Paris, though, and they liberated it in August of 1944, right? And this right here, of course, is actually like French citizens and Americans walking down the Champs-Élysées with the Arc de Triomphe in the back and then being liberated. Now we've got the French army back, and so we have the French army back in our fold, right? And so now we've got 3 different fronts in this war. 3 different fronts coming and crushing in on Hitler and his allies and stuff like that, right? Now, the scariest battle that actually happened ended up being in December and January of 1945. Because when we actually got into this general area right here, it's gone into winter, right? Now, the Russians, they know how to do winter, right? They can winter very well. So they actually held the Nazis up and began to push them backwards during the winter, right? But we got stuck in December and January 1945 at this famous battle known as the Battle of the Bulge, right? Whereas as the Allies pushed the Germans back, a huge standoff happened in the Ardennes forest, right? In the middle of an extremely gruelingly cold winter. And also the weather was so chaotic, basically the American soldiers and the Nazi soldiers basically could barely see each other, right? The fog was so dense. The snow was so heavy. And also the ground was so hard, it was very difficult for the American soldiers to actually dig foxholes and actually dig areas to actually fortify themselves in this forest. They said that you could look over and sometimes Americans were trying to be digging with their hands and sometimes their fingernails would come off because it was that cold out there. The other crazy thing about it is it was so, I could not fight in this. This is a winter to the nth degree. No thank you whatsoever. And also because you're now pushing into the border of Germany, so the Germans have these cities heavily fortified and can launch artillery shells back at you. But it was known as the Battle of the Bulge because that weather was so bad, because the winter was so grueling. Literally, the lines would advance outward. They would go bleh, and they would actually gain territory, the Allies would, but then they would lose it, right here, because they couldn't see anything, right? And so it would be yarn. Ugh. There are literally reports from American soldiers and German soldiers saying they went up to go to the bathroom and then there was just an enemy right there also going to the bathroom because they didn't know where each other were. But that's why they called it the Battle of the Bulge, because the lines bulged out so dramatically, right? And it happened in the Ardennes forest and was in this middle of this grueling winter. But in the long run, what ends up happening is the Allies are able to withstand, and they actually siege a city called Bastogne, and they actually then go into the German borders, right? So now, after winning the Battle of the Bulge, you got the Allies coming in from the west. You got them coming up also from Italy. You got the Russians coming in from the east. And then, of course, these men take the coward's way out, right? By the spring of 1945, by the time the Battle of the Bulge is a victory for the Allies, by the spring of 1945, Russians are now pushing into Berlin. The German capital, of course, Berlin, which I'm going to this summer. I'm very excited. Allies were pushing into the east and up through Italy as well, like I just said, right? And so what's going to end up happening is these guys are going to die. When what I mean by these guys, I mean Mussolini and Hitler, right? Because Benito Mussolini is actually going to be shot and killed by his own people. During this entire process, while the Allied forces are coming up through Italy, the people of Italy are like, this guy was a liar and hoodwinked us and is not actually really, really legit. So he's actually going to be shot by his own people and then hung upside down. His body, right here, actually, this is him, would be hung upside down from a gas station ceiling, and people walked by and hit him with a stick. And then I've heard from one of my college professors that they then took his head and put it on a stick and ran through the streets of Italy with it, which is wild, right? Benito Mussolini, though, would be shot and killed and then hung from a gas station ceiling. Hitler committed suicide because we talked about this in class a bunch of times, he committed suicide after getting married for a day, right? So he got married to his wife, Eva Braun. They went down into a bunker for a day. And he committed suicide because he was so afraid of the Russian military that if they got to him, that what's going to end up happening is he's going to have a very slow and brutal death. So he took the coward's way out and he shot himself rather than answering for the crimes that he had committed. And it was in this bunker that he actually did it. Now, after the fact, okay, they're going to, of course, publish this all over the newspapers and things like that. And after the fact, a lot of people were like, well, where is Hitler's body now? Well, he actually was then cremated. And burned in a ditch by the Nazi military because they didn't want to see his body just scattered all over the place. The only thing we have left of Hitler's entire body is actually his jaw. So Hitler's jaw. So literally this is the only piece of physical evidence that we have that Hitler was actually there on that day. And they've actually done forensic testing on his jaw. French dentists and scientists have actually done a lot of forensic testing, extensive forensic testing on his actual teeth. And as you can see, he had a lot of false teeth, a lot of gold teeth, real gross. And it turns out that it's 100% his. Like, they found out that actually they're pretty confident, almost beyond a shadow of a doubt, that that is his and that he was actually his body was burned on that day, right? Now, going into it, though, after he commits suicide and after the Italians kill Benito Mussolini, May 8th, 1945 is known as VE Day, as Victory in Europe Day, right? And so this means that the war is now finally over within Europe, right? Because now we can actually move towards peace and recouping and figuring out what we're going to do. And this summer, when I actually go to a couple of different cities, we're going to talk about that in some of those TikToks and YouTubes that I post, or whatever, some YouTube videos I post. I'm going to talk about, like, what happened in Germany after World War II, right? Like, what did they do? Like, how did they actually go from being a place under the leadership of a dictator to being what they are now, right? Like now, look. So looking at it, though, is we now have to turn to the Pacific Theater, because remember, we had a European theater and a Pacific Theater, right? So the thing about it is, though, also when we're looking at it, it wasn't completely like Europe first. Like, we actually showed up in in the Pacific Theater around 1943. So we actually were there before we even did D-Day, right? So the thing about it, though, is, or Operation Overlord. So the big thing about it is that we turn to the Pacific Theater and we adopt the strategy known as island hopping. And we come to this actually because after this one famous battle known as the Battle of Midway, we realized that an air raid campaign is going to be a very dangerous one. And it's very difficult to fight in the Pacific because literally it's mostly over water. And then the areas that the Japanese have, they're dug into these islands very aggressively, right? And so the thing about it is we adopt this strategy called island hopping, where we decided that we would just take one island at a time and lead these really large land sieges. And the campaign itself was relatively pretty successful. We took back the Marshall Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and things like that. There are very famous island hopping sieges known as Iwo Jima, which is this very famous picture came from the siege of Iwo Jima, and then also that of Okinawa, right? And Okinawa was one of the ones that actually claimed a lot of American lives due to the fact that the Japanese actually had tunnels dug into most of the areas itself. But when we got actually very close, when we're in Philippines and Guam and places like that, we then had to decide, what do we do here? Do we invade Japan directly? Do we actually get on boats, go over there to this island, and then hop off of it like we did in Europe? And do we invade Japan directly, territorially, terrestrially? And that became a really drastic decision, because literally what ends up happening is by the end of the war, we've got a new guy making decisions. Because FDR is going to die while he's in office. And Harry S. Truman is going to be the man that takes over presidency after him. Well, the entire time during this war, in the background, there was this scientific project known as the Manhattan Project, right? And the Manhattan Project had several different scientists working off of the ideas of Newton and Rutherford and some other people like that. And it was a secret campaign led to try and create the very first nuclear bomb, right? And this guy right here is one of the lead scientists that actually helped create this device. And he actually is a man that says he wishes he could uninvent this device, right? And so what his name is J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is spelled Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer was actually one of the lead scientists on this Manhattan Project to create the very first nuclear weapons. And right before we were trying to decide to invade Japan, the nuclear devices were created and tested. Now, FDR died on April 12th, before VE Day, before Hitler even died, and actually before Mussolini even died. FDR himself died. And when Truman rose to presidency, he made one of the most controversial decisions out there, right? Because a lot of historians debate if it was necessary or not. And he was the one that made the decision to drop the nuclear armaments on Japan, right? And he actually threatened Japan first. He was like, we have devices of mass destruction and you need to surrender now. And when they refused, Little Boy is the name of the bomb, right? The name of the nuclear device was known as Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima, a small Japanese city, in August 6th of 1945, right? And then this is going to claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And what's going to end up happening after that is he then threatens Japan again. And when they refuse to surrender, less than 3 days later, we drop another one known as Fat Man, a nuclear provision that was even larger and claimed even more lives on the small city called Nagasaki, right? And then following these two nuclear armament drops that killed a lot of civilians, the death toll in total was 200,000 plus, and most of them were civilians, Japan will surrender on September 2nd, 1945, right? So, and then that means that we're going to have the J Day, was Victory in Japan Day, right? Now, overall, it is believed that World War II cost the lives of a total of 85 to possibly 100 million people. That's 3 to 5%, y'all, of the world population at the time. Land on multiple continents was destroyed. And why? Just because a couple of really evil people wanted to rise to power, try to give men back their masculinity when they really didn't need to, right? And also due to like terrible economic situations after World War I. But the big thing about it is, though, is that's it, y'all. That's it. That's Western Civ, right? That's the whole course, okay? So the big thing about it is I just want to go ahead and give y'all a huge shout out. Class of 2025. I think y'all are massively underrated, right? I think that y'all are a great group of kids. I really, really enjoyed working with y'all this year. And going into next year, right, going into U.S. history and stuff like that, if y'all ever need anything at all, if y'all ever want to just come hang out and say hello, if y'all ever need any help understanding anything for U.S. history, anything that we might have actually talked about before, you know that you're always more than welcome to ask, okay? So I'll miss you guys a lot next year, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that you got something out of this course. And like I said, I'm always here, so just shout if you ever need anything, all right? Y'all have a good one.